So today what we're going to be doing is we are going to be doing the first part of the Cold War lecture. So this is going to be one of three. And today we're going to be looking at kind of the roots of the Cold War, how it started, what it was, all that kind of good stuff. And in order to understand the Cold War, you really have to go back to the end of World War II. So at the end of World War II, rather than a treaty to end the war, what they decided to do instead was have a series of conferences, because obviously Treaty Versailles did not go over so well. So they decide, for this one, we're just going to talk things out, right? And a lot of these conferences actually begin before World War II even ended. There were a huge number of them, but we're going to talk about three of them that have an impact on the Cold War. So the first one is a conference that happened in Tehran in 1943. This is the first time that the quote-unquote Big Three meet up. And those Big Three, in order from right to left, are Winston Churchill, who is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is the President of the United States, and of course, Joseph Stalin, who is the leader of the USSR, the Soviet Union. And the Tehran Conference was kind of this idea, like, we know Hitler's going to lose, right? At this point, the turning point of the war has taken place. And what Stalin really wants for the Tehran Conference is to be able to set up Eastern Europe to liberate it himself, right? So the idea is that, and now that he's pushed Hitler out of the Soviet Union, he's going to be marching through Eastern Europe. And the idea is that he's going to let, free Poland and all of these other Eastern European countries, because we were friends with Russia at the time, the Soviet Union at the time. We were like, you know what? Okay, I guess, right? Looking back on it, we can see that that's a little suspect, right? The next conference happens in 1945 in Yalta. And so again, we have our Big Three, Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. So in Yalta, Hitler pledges that he's going to allow democratic elections in Eastern Europe. So it's the idea that, like, okay, remember I told you I was liberating them. But now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to let them decide for themselves the way that their government is going to be set up. They also decided at Yalta that they were going to divide Germany up into 4 occupation zones. So the point of that is to basically say that each one of the parts of Germany is going to go to one of the allies, so France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, and that they were going to help them rebuild and get them back on their feet. So eventually they would be allowed to reunify, right? That's kind of the point of this. But it's sort of our way of helping Germany get back, right? Then last but not least, we have the Potsdam Conference. So if you notice here, it looks a little bit differently. That's because we have a whole new group of people. Now we still have Joseph Stalin over on the left, but now we have a new British Prime Minister. So he has replaced Winston Churchill. We have Harry Truman, who replaced Franklin Roosevelt as president when he passed away. And then, of course, like I said, we have Stalin, who looks very sad in this picture. But at Potsdam, basically, Stalin told Truman, free elections are not going to happen, right? Whoops. Wait a minute. You said you're going to hold free elections in Eastern Europe. What do you mean? And Stalin says, well, here's what I've decided. I'm going to have a buffer zone. And these Eastern European countries are going to be a blockade, basically, between Germany and the Soviet Union. And so they're going to be part of the Soviet bloc, or the Eastern Bloc. And they're going to keep us basically safe from any future German installments. Well, Germany had been demilitarized, denazified. The Soviet Union was not really in trouble from Germany. But this was really Stalin's way of saying, I'm going to take these Eastern European countries and I'm going to control them for myself. So this really kind of sets up the ideological differences between the United States and Western Europe versus the Soviet Union, right? So for Stalin and the Soviets' point of view, democracies have always been very hostile, right? So they weren't crazy about the democratic government, and they said, as a democracy, some people don't have power, right? Like, the poor people of society lose power as a result of that. Also, Stalin was pretty mad because he felt like Britain and the United States did not follow through on some promises that they had made during the war itself. And the Soviets, they thought communism was more equal, right? So to them, the concept of democracy and capitalism was evil. Now, for the United States, they saw capitalism and democracy as allowing freedom of choice, right? Whereas in the Soviet Union under communism, there was no choice. The government ran the state, the government ran everything, ran the economy. They told you what jobs to have, how much food you could keep, what you could own. That goes against American ideology, right? So this really kind of sets up those ideological differences that are going to be the basis of the Cold War. So the first thing that really kind of has to happen in order to set up what's going to be the rest of the Cold War is the containment policy. So the containment policy basically says the United States is going to prevent the spread of communism in whatever way that they can, right? And the first and the best way to do this is with money, because poor people are the ones who are tempted by communism. Now, here's the problem. Most European countries are broke. So we're really worried that they're going to turn to communism, especially as a result of the war itself. And so the United States says, you know what? We got money. We had an economic boom during the war. We're going to help you guys out. So from 1948 to 1952, we issue what's called the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan basically is just the United States giving money to Europe to help them rebuild. You can see most of the money went to the places that the war was fought. So France, the United Kingdom, Italy, all countries that are on our side now. And that money is there to help them rebuild. And millions of dollars ended up going to the Marshall, or as part of the Marshall Plan to Europe. And as a result, they recovered. It's called the economic miracle. Like, yay, they recovered. If you look at this map, you'll notice that there are some places who did not take the money. So one is Spain. If you remember, Spain was neutral during World War II. They're led by General Franco, and Spain didn't really need it, right? Because, again, they didn't fight in the war. The others are these Eastern European countries: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and of course the Soviet Union. This is the Eastern Bloc, right? That's that buffer zone that Stalin wanted to create. And basically the Soviet Union said, you guys can't take any money, right? Not going to let it happen. Next thing that we do here in order to prevent the spread of communism is we help Greece and Turkey. So there were, or the Soviet Union had attempted to basically take Greece and Turkey as part of their bloc, and we say no, right? We give them aid, and there are communist insurgents within Greece and Turkey. We give them dollars, we give them aid, and basically say, we're going to help you guys become not communist, right? And that's exactly what we do. So the containment policy, again, the idea is that we're not getting rid of communism where it already exists, right? But we're going to keep it from spreading to other places. And this is going to be something that we hope by the end of it will, get rid of communism everywhere, right? That's kind of the plan. Doesn't really work, but we're going to try it anyway. So the next thing we have is Germany, right? So we have partitioned Germany, right? If you look at the map up here, we've got our different occupation zones. We've got the Soviet occupation zone, the US occupation zone, the French occupation zone, and the UK occupation zone. And again, the idea is that theoretically, once Germany is no longer a threat, we will let them rebuild, right? And they can reunify and everything will be great. Well, the problem is that the Soviets did not want to let them rebuild, right? So Germany, the Soviets made Germany pay them lots and lots of money, lots and lots of reparations, which they did not have. They also kind of dominated their zone. They did not allow like resources and things to come in and out. And eventually, the rest of Germany, so the occupation zones over here by 1949, with the help of Britain, France, and the United States, had rebuilt and reunified. And West Germany became an independent country, right? So West Germany forms on itself, and the Soviet part of Germany doesn't. And it officially becomes East Germany, or the Democratic Republic of Germany. Technically, it's led by its own leader, but really it's led by the communists, right? So in 1948, the city of Berlin is also located, if you look right here, in the middle of that occupation zone, the German occupation, or the Russian occupation zone. Well, we had also split up the city of Berlin. And the Soviets basically want to get all of the Allies out of Berlin. And so they ordered in 1948 that all roads and ways into the city of Berlin were going to be closed, right? We're going to block them with Soviet troops. Supplies cannot get in or out, and allies cannot get in or out, and we are not going to let this happen. So the United States ordered a massive airlift. It's called the Berlin Airlift. And over the course of a year, almost 300,000 planes flew from West Germany into East Germany, bringing supplies, medicine, oil, fuel, food, all this kind of stuff. At its peak, at the top of it, a flight landed in Berlin every 45 seconds. And there was nothing the Soviets could do about it, right? Because if you look at this political cartoon down here, right, we've got Stalin and we've got Truman. And if you'll notice, they're very big fighting over the city of Berlin, but they're fighting with teeny tiny swords. But Truman has a very special weapon in his back pocket, the atom bomb. The Soviets have not developed hydrogen or atomic weapons yet. So the Soviets were afraid that if they put too much pressure on Berlin, then they would cause the United States to use the atomic bomb against them. So they didn't do anything. After 11 months, the Soviets agreed to lift the blockade, and Berlin was opened up temporarily. Doesn't last forever. But really, this is just an example of how the arms race is really going to take off, because the Soviets are going to realize if they're going to fight against the United States, they're going to need weapons that are equal to the United States. And so they begin developing their own atomic weapons. And eventually, by the end of the 40s, the beginning of the 50s, the Soviets will have developed the atomic bomb themselves. So we also realized in 1949, in response to the Berlin crisis, that we needed a security organization, right? The United Nations is great. We love the UN, but we need a military backup, right? So in 1949, they formed NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So basically the key phrase here is collective security, right? So basically all of the democracies of Europe, including Canada and the United States, come together and say, we are going to prevent Soviet expansion, right? So there are 12 members total at the time. If one of those members becomes attacked by the Soviets, all 12 of those countries are going to come together and defend them, right? So the idea behind that is to, again, prevent the communists from growing. But it's this idea like, you can't defeat all of us, right? So NATO in 1950, or in response to the formation of NATO, rather, in 1955, the Soviet Union forms what is called the Warsaw Pact. So it's similar to NATO, it's this collective security, and instead of the democracies, it is the Soviet Union and these Eastern Bloc countries, so Poland, Hungary, Romania, all of Czechoslovakia, all of those. Now that the Cold War is over, NATO still exists. It's just got a whole different mission. But if you look, by 1962, NATO has spread, whether it's countries who are aligned with NATO, countries who are aligned with Soviet or the Warsaw Pact, it does spread. So this is kind of where we stand at the end of the 40s. Everything changes for us in the 50s, right? Because in 1949, Mao Zedong, who is this guy up here, decides to lead a communist revolution in China. So he moves very quickly throughout China. The people did not support the current government. They were a very repressive government, they didn't support him. And so Mao Zedong was able to get the support of the popular people, move through the country very quickly, and in 1950 established the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, right? Also sometimes nicknamed Red China as Communist China. This is a huge blow, right? Because first of all, it's a failure of the containment policy. But this was also the US's biggest ally in Asia, and now it is allied with the Soviet Union. It is gone. That is a problem, right? So this is a big hit. In 1950, something very similar happens in Korea. So Korea at the end of World War II had been divided into two different occupation zones, the North and the South, right? In North Korea, a communist government was set up by the Soviet Union. In South Korea, a democratic government was set up by the United States. And in 1950, Northern forces crossed the 38th parallel, which is the middle point of Korea, and invaded South Korea. The war goes on for 3 years, from 1950 to 1953. The UN forces are led by General Douglas MacArthur, who is a US military general. And basically, what happens is it kind of goes back and forth at the beginning of the war for the first few months of the war. And then we spend the rest of the war at the 38th parallel fighting each other. It's a stalemate, nothing really happening. So by 1953, a ceasefire is reached. They draw a border at the 38th parallel and say the North is going to remain communist, the South is going to remain democratic. So it basically ended exactly how it started. But containment happened, right? We were able to contain communism in North Korea. So a lot of people thought that it was a success as a result of that. It is still divided today, right? We still have North and South Korea. North Korea is still a very secluded communist country. South Korea is still a very democratic country. So that was kind of the first example of the Cold War, quote unquote, heating up, as it were. It is also in 1949 that the Soviets' very first test, hold on.
Mr. Bradford, could you call the front office? Mr. Bradford.
Always happens that way, right? So it's in 1949 that the Soviets test the atomic bomb. That means that the United States no longer has a nuclear monopoly, right? So some of it came from spies. A lot of people are spying on the US program. There were also Soviet scientists, got to give them some credit. So we decide we need a bigger and better bomb. This launches the space race. In 1952, we launched the first hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb is 10 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. So if you look at this map here, you can see this is the A-bomb range. This is the hydrogen bomb range. Very big, very different. So we develop in 1952. Yes, we're winning the space race. Soviets develop it in 1953. So basically, the world has two nuclear superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And we begin this policy of massive retaliation, right? And basically what this means is come up with President Eisenhower, and it says, we'll bomb you if you try to bomb us, right? So we'll find out if you've launched a bomb on us, and we'll bomb you first. So if we're all gonna go out, we're all gonna go. If we're gonna go out, everybody's gonna go out. So you look at this political cartoon, you've got the two armies fighting each other with bows and arrows. Now they have these huge bombs, right? It kind of jokes the H-bomb, the Z-bomb, the Y-bomb, but it says on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate, right? That's massive retaliation. But it also leads to this very atmosphere of fear in the United States and really in Western Europe as well, that this might eventually lead to atomic warfare. And that's really something that worries people. So let's talk a little bit about the Soviet Union under Stalin. So the Soviet Union in the early 40s, Winston Churchill makes this very famous speech where he says an iron curtain has descended on Europe. Now he didn't mean a literal iron curtain, but basically what he's saying is Europe is now divided in half, right? On one side we have the democratic countries, on one side we have Russia and their quote unquote allies. But from 1945 to 1964, 1945 to 1953, sorry, Russia is ruled by Stalin, right? Now, Stalin has a pretty oppressive rule. The World War II in Russia was called the Great Patriotic War, the idea being like, we're gonna defend the fatherland, that sort of thing. But between 1946 and 1953, the Soviet government was responsible for the deaths of over 12 million people, of its own citizens. It is more than any other period in the 20th century, including like the Russian Revolution, including war. A lot of people are sent to death camps in the Soviet Union. They are called gulags, G-U-L-A-G-S, and they are forced labor camps, very similar to what was set up during World War II in Nazi Europe. Culture and art are purged. Basically, if the government doesn't like it, you can't do it. And Stalin, like I said, he gets rid of all of his political enemies. again, it's known as the Great Purge, where he purges out everybody. It's a pretty harsh environment. Now, in Eastern Europe itself, they are very much dominated by the Soviet Union. All of these countries are led by a one-party state. And that one party is, of course, the Communist Party. The secret police, the KGB, are the ones who are keeping them under control, right? So just some images here kind of shows you how bad things are. So this is a picture of a gulag, of a labor camp. This particular image kind of gets me every time. So it looks like, oh, just look at the poor Russian people, right? There's the bottom of that image, right? These are the deaths of their children. Not pretty, right? So things were really bad in Soviet Russia. And of those Soviet bloc states, only Yugoslavia was not dominated by the Soviets. They were dominated instead by Marshal Josip Broz Tito. Just remember Tito. But basically, they had freed themselves from the Nazi domination without the help of the Soviet Union. So they were able to get out before the Soviets took over. They did have a mixed economy with private ownership of certain businesses, but they also had a communist, like, collective ownership of farming and certain industries. However, things were not great under Tito in Yugoslavia. Like I said, it's pretty ugly. Just kind of some other things that go on under Soviet control. Over 500,000 Czechs who were seen as a threat to the communist state were purged. 200,000 were arrested in Hungary, 180,000 in Romania, 80,000 in Albania. In 1953, there was an uprising in East Germany. It was crushed by the Soviet troops. The post-war economic recovery was very slow, right? Things did not progress. And basically, everybody was kind of not doing great. The one exception is Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was well industrialized. They had a strong middle class and a working class, and they were able to basically maintain a democratic rule, political democracy, even between the wars. In response, however, to the Marshall Plan, Stalinists did replace their government with a one-party communist government. But like I said, Czechoslovakia is still the one sort of major power that survives. Now, in 1953, Stalin dies, and Nikita Khrushchev comes into power. So Nikita Khrushchev, just a little introduction to him here, and I'll get more into him in the next video. But basically, he emerged as a leader after a power struggle. And he realized, like many of Stalin's leaders, that there needed to be reform, right? There was a widespread fear and hatred of Stalin's power, of the terror he instituted. Agriculture was in bad shape. Consumer goods were in bad shape. Everything was tough, right? So Khrushchev started what he called de-Stalinization. In 1956, basically, he denounced Stalin, right? Gave a speech, said, Stalin messed up. Right? We gotta, get rid of anything that reminds us of Stalin. It's called the secret anti-Stalin speech, right? And it's a really important speech. And they start basically breaking down statues of Stalin. They start trying to go back on some of his policies. They establish what's called the Gosplan, the Gosplan, and resources shifted away from heavy machinery and the military and towards consumer goods and economics, right? So the idea being is let's compete with the rest of the world, right? We don't have to do heavy industry the way we have been. Let's prove that communism is better than capitalism, right? So if you look at this picture down here, this is Richard Nixon when he was vice president with Nikita Khrushchev looking at all of their consumer goods.
Todd Donahue, your ride is in carpool. They are waiting for you. Todd Donahue.
So Nikita Khrushchev and Richard Nixon looking at consumer goods here. And basically, they began competing with the United States in a lot of ways. So yeah, this is pretty amazing. However, things are not all, happy-go-lucky, right? Khrushchev did make a statement that said to the Western United States, basically saying, we will bury you. Now, he didn't mean it as a military threat. He meant it economically. But it didn't really help tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Your main enemy says, we're going to bury you, right? Like, that's not great. The But desalinization did result in some communist reforms. The masses of Russia started seeking a little bit more liberty and independence. Khrushchev was willing to allow other forms of socialism, not just strict communism. So that's really important. In Poland, March of 1956, riots resulted, but it led to the release of 99,000 political prisoners. So that, it's a pretty big deal. So Khrushchev eased up a little bit, right? In some ways, not in every way. That leads us to the Hungarian uprising. So the Hungarian uprising basically was a group of Hungarian nationalists who decided that they wanted to get rid of the communist parties. They wanted non-communist parties to be legalized, and they went against the government. They went against the government believing that because of the containment policy, the United States would help them out. The United States did not do that. You can hear stories of like getting on the radio and hearing like these Hungarian students, they were all young kids, these Hungarian students saying, help us, you promised to send aid. But we didn't. And we didn't because we didn't want to start a nuclear war. We kind of decided that, you know what, Hungary, we're sorry, but we can't tempt the Soviets over this. In the end, Soviet tanks and troops responded by crushing the rebellion. Communist rule was reestablished, and it pretty much showed the rest of Eastern Europe that the United States wasn't really going to help them all that much, right? And so this really kind of allowed for the Eastern European countries to say, you know what, we're going to stick with Khrushchev, we're going to stick with the Soviet Union for now. And this leads to what is known as a peaceful coexistence, right? Where basically the United States and the Soviet Union, they don't really get along all that great, but we're not going to, we're going to try to improve relationships. So in 1955, the Geneva Summit met. We tried to come up with discussions to begin talking about disarmament, nuclear disarmament specifically, about European security. They didn't reach an agreement, but it was step one, right? It's pretty important. Austria also got independence from the Soviet Union in 1955. So that's a significant reduction of tensions. And this is all very big, very important. Until Sputnik. In 1957, a Russian satellite is sent into orbit and brought back safely by the Soviet Union. That's Sputnik. And this terrified Americans. Basically, this said the Soviet was ahead of us in technology, and we were not okay with that. So this launches what we call the space race. And essentially what's going to happen is we're going to be trying to get, see who can get into space first, right? Spoiler alert, the Soviets kind of beat us for a while. They send in the first satellite, they send in the first living creature, a dog, which unfortunately doesn't make it, and they send in the first human into orbit. The one thing we beat them in is by landing on the moon first. So I guess that's something. Now, Khrushchev also begins to kind of look outside of the traditional Soviet Union as well. He basically begins wooing African and Asian nations and promised them aid in the idea that they would become communist. So you can kind of see down here, he promises Laos, Ethiopia, Nigeria, or Algeria rather, Congo, basically says, hey, don't you guys want to get some help from the Soviet Union? We've got money now, we can help you guys out. We can make sure that you are stable, and hopefully they'll turn to communism, right? So that was kind of the point of that. So this wraps up the beginning of the Cold War. In the next couple of videos, you'll see how the Cold War kind of builds to a height and then the fall of the Soviet Union. So I hope you learned a little something, and I'll see you next time.